Hey, welcome to the Everyday Sniper. You got Frank at Sniper's Hide here, bringing you the latest of the Everyday Sniper podcast. We got Mike back at Mile High. He's working this week. We're going to get together with him a little later. I know he's got some really good stuff planned for when the two of us do our next episode together. But jumping right into it, I want to give a quick shout out to everybody over at YouTube. I'm probably going to throw this video up for everybody to take a look at. I haven't advertised this a whole lot, so we're going to do a little bit of advertisement. Again, thanks to everybody heading back over to Sniper's Hide. Place has been busy. It's rocking. We got the Everyday Sniper podcast section there. Guys are putting in a lot of really good questions, and I appreciate that. The questions have been just fantastic. And getting into that, I'm going to tackle one of the big ones right now. Early in the week, so I can go and do a kind of a multi-segment series right here. And it's going to start off with the wind. Now, the wind is the great equalizer. That's the one element that everybody out there is chasing. How do I manage the wind? How do I shoot in the wind? And it's so important that when I talk about long-range shooting, I have an acronym that I use, and it's called WTF. You heard that right? WTF. And what that stands for is wind, trajectory, fundamentals of marksmanship. Fundamental Frank bringing you the fundamentals of marksmanship. WTF. And if you notice, the first thing in that acronym is wind, because wind's really the most important thing once we get on the range and we're doing this for real. Now, if you're out there doping and practicing and you're working up something, well, then we're working on our elevation most importantly. That's our beginning, is getting our elevation established. Once our elevation's established, it's pretty much a given. We know how to adjust for our elevation pretty darn well. The variable that we're working on, the problem that we have to solve, is the wind. The goal of the precision rifle shooter is to manage the wind within 1 mile per hour across the entire flight of the bullet. I'll say right now, that's almost impossible, because wind doesn't move in a straight line, wind doesn't move at a constant speed, wind's going to do whatever the heck it wants to do, based on a whole bunch of factors that we're going to go over across the next couple episodes. So what we're looking to do is get that 1 mile an hour read. And in order to do that, I break it down into two elements: the science department and the art department. Now, the science department is where you can read the wind to within better than 1 mile an hour. And how we do that, that's with us. That's where I'm standing with a Kestrel in my hand. Kestrel, scientific piece of equipment. You know, it's a tool, scientific tool, and I can stand there and read the wind within 1 mile an hour. If I'm looking 1,000 yards away and I see a tree blowing, I'm not reading it to within 1 mile an hour. I'm guessing. So the science department begins with the shooter, because that's where it all starts. It starts with us, the shooter. And to take you back a little bit, I'm gonna tell you some of my mindset here. I get up in the morning, I say I'm gonna go to the range. Load up the car, get in it, I hop on the highway. As I'm going down the highway, I'm looking at target indicators that are on the way between me and my house and the range. Now, out here in the front range, we have wind flags on the highway. When the winds do pick up, you'll see the tumbleweeds come across. You'll see, honestly, a big mess. Just the other day, when I was trying to do that load development and the wind was cranking that, 18, and then when I left, it was 25, 30 miles an hour. There was accidents and tractor trailers and stuff all over the highway blown because the wind just knocks them over out here. I had mentioned about the tractor trailers in Wyoming, how the wind in Wyoming, they'll shut the highways down because the wind will actually blow tractor trailers over. So as soon as I leave, I'm looking at the wind, and it all starts with us. So then we have the art department. The art department is called that, and it's the name I gave it, because everything else downrange is subjective. No two people, see something the same way. If we're looking at a Picasso, somebody says it's the greatest painting I've ever seen. The next guy looks at it and says, what a hunk of garbage. You paid what? Because what it is it's an artistic interpretation of what we see, feel, and hear. We're using our senses with the wind, right? So we see what it's doing to the target indicators around us, we feel it on our body, and we hear it gust and ebb and flow, especially through our ear protection, right? If you have that turned up, you'll have that sound in there that you'll get. So once we look at that, we then begin to understand what the wind is doing. So just think about it. No two people see and read the same thing the same way. We're unique. We're individuals, right? So I may look at something and go, oh, I think it's 8 miles an hour. The next guy may look at it and go, I think it's 6 miles an hour. Another guy may look at it and go, oh, I think that's gusting at 10 miles an hour. So it's not consistent in what people are seeing, feeling, and hearing because we were all gauged different. One of the biggest variables and why people get this wrong is because of the wind roses out there. The clock system that we use to describe what direction the wind is coming from. See them everywhere. They got out there. You got a full value wind. You got, the 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, the head and tail they'll say is no value. But then there's the clock system between full and no value. And what people will say is that is a half value wind. And somebody on the line will say, okay, my full value hold is 1 mil, my full value hold is 4 MOA, whatever the case may be. And then somebody says that's a half value wind. So what they immediately do is hold, wait for it, half. And guess what? They're wrong. A half value wind is just telling you it's half the value between full and 0, but the number is not halfway. You're actually holding 3/4 of a full value when someone says it's a half value wind. So right away you got to correct that. Right away we've been saying it wrong. By using that language, by using that verbiage, we've screwed everybody up right out of the gate. Remember Wonderama, Telephone, all those games we were talking about? Well, this is one of those things where they've messed you up by calling it a half value wind when the hold is really 3/4 of a full value hold. A quarter value wind is actually half the hold, where a half value wind is 3/4 the hold. Got it? Once we're there, we then break the wind down into our wind zones, and we break the wind down into 3 distinct wind zones. We have wind at the shooter, wind mid-range, and wind at the target. And we'll go, kind of quick and break down each one of those, but I will tell you right off the bat, the most important one we're going to worry about is wind at the shooter. We just said everything starts and stops with you. You're the guy. So what's most important is where you're standing and where you're shooting from, because it's the longest time of flight. Once the bullet is blown off course, it stays off course, and it doesn't come back on course because there's no pilot in there. That's kind of where those progression comments come from. I shoot terrible at 100, but I can put them in one hole at 1,000. Okay, yeah, whatever. But let's get back to wind at the shooter before I distract myself.
Three for 3 after the adjustment with the wind.
So it's the foundation for all wind calls, right? It's where we're standing. It's what we see, feel, and hear, as well as what we can read with a wind meter. It's the only place we can read it to within better of 1 mile an hour. And like I said, it all has to start somewhere, and it starts with you. And before I get too crazy into it, I am a big advocate of Kestrel wind meters. I think if you're going to be a successful long-range shooter, you need something to read the wind within better than 1 mile an hour. It doesn't mean you have to go out and buy the most expensive Kestrel with all the software in it. If you're already running software, you may not need more software that does the same exact thing. But at least have some kind of Kestrel and make sure that model does at least density altitude, because they all don't do density altitude, although most of them will do wind. It's not super necessary if it gives you temperature and barometric pressure, but if you get the ones with density altitude, you at least got a leg up on the competition that way.
Hit.
After wind at the shooter, we have wind mid-range. And wind mid-range is good for establishing an average, but it only works best on a square range. And we'll kind of get into terrain and things like that a little bit later. Terrain itself is a whole nother conversation. But the reason why we want to talk about wind mid-range is because of max ordinate. Max ordinate is where the highest point in the bullet's flight path before it starts coming back down. And why that's important is because of wind gradients. The higher you come off the ground, the increased in wind speed you'll get because of wind gradients. Less resistance from the earth as you move up, and the wind speed will pick up. A wind gradient goes about every 14 to 15 feet above your line of sight there. And just as an example, 175 at 1,000 yards, going about 2,600 feet per second, will have a max ordinate of about 15 feet. So we're coming into that next wind gradient where the wind resistance is less up there, and so you get a little bit higher velocity. If I read the wind at my position on the ground, it might read 6 miles an hour. At max ord, it might read 8 miles an hour or some variation thereof. And it's about just past halfway. So for a 1,000-yard shot, rounding now, it's about 600 yards. So that's where your max ord would be on a 1,000-yard shot with a 308. It's slightly off from there, but I'm not going to get it too deep into the weeds with you guys. Lastly, we'll break it down into wind at the target. Wind at the target's the most difficult to read because it's the farthest away, right? I mean, that far away, you can't tell exactly what it's doing. We're guesstimating. However, it does have the shortest time of flight. So it has the least effect. And that goes against the old wives' tale that's out there, where everybody says, well, gee, Frank, but the bullet is slowing down, and if the wind is going to push, it's going to push it harder because the bullet's going slower. Well, guess what? It's not going that slow. It's still supersonic for most of what we're doing. If you're in the transonic and subsonic, it's a whole nother conversation. I'm not even going to get into that, but let's talk right now as if we're shooting supersonic bullet 1,000 yards. We're still above 1,300 feet per second at the intended target. So understand, it's not going that slow. We still have that solid drift information through the BC and through what's going on because it hasn't slowed down. The other thing is, because it's coming off of max ord and it's heading down now, you get a little bit of a gravity assist, so it's helping it into the target a little bit. So the drift from wind at the target isn't as great as it would be as if we're reading mid-range or wind at the shooter. Now, the nice thing with wind at the target, though, it's where our final focus is. If I'm looking through the scope at my target, I can see indicators around my target to make a final truing adjustment for my hold. So I could have gauged my average and I know what's going on, and then when I look at the target, I'm looking at some of the indicators down there. And a great example of that is some of the square ranges and the high power ranges. Wait a second, let the guy next to you shoot. When the dirt flies up behind the target, see what it's doing. You know, so that's an example of using wind at the target. I won't be the first guy to fire a shot. I'll wait till the guy next to me shoots. Then I'll look at what the dirt's doing and say, okay, the dirt just flew up and did that pretty hard. I'm going to make this hold. And that's my final adjustment. So, art department, science department, 3 wind zones, shooter, mid-range, target. So we'll begin to break some of that stuff down for you and start talking about how we address these different elements of the wind.